Good evening, the news gang is here, and tonight the Kiambaa fall, the fallout, and the people falling over themselves to tell us how and why it happened. Also, pushing the wheelbarrow up Mount Kenya. What lessons for UDA? Plus, if you thought only Kanu had a jogo, well, the Jubilee chickens too are coming home to roost. But which home? On Yvonne's take, a broken record and a record high number. We are talking COVID here. The memo borrows from the debt of shame. Are you a victim? On the punchline tonight, are we ready for the big one? Just ask the voters of Kiambaa. And on the angle tonight, the big pissing contest at the Fountain of Knowledge. The kicker is away tonight. That means Kaka is on a break. But we have Wilson Mushora here as our sign language gangster. Let's start the show.
My friend, everybody here is interim, eh? Including the party leader, deputy, everybody is interim. We are telling you now how we are going to organize this party so that you have bona fide officials all from the ground, he has told you, all the way up to the National Delegate Conference. And those who are willing to have some of these seats, they are free to come and contest for them.
Nobody's been ejected out of office. We are united. We have reviewed the just concluded by-elections. We have also looked at our long-term strategic plans, and that's why we have come up with program to rejuvenate the party, to have the party presence felt.
But we think we gave it our best shot.
Yes, yeah.
And we think we actually won. That is the message you're getting from this group.
You know this election was rigged. You know it. We will be going to court to determine and to prove to Kenyans that this election was rigged.
Interesting. Francis, it's not often that we hear people who are closely associated with the government allege that, you know, an election was stolen. But interesting that we were here last week, you know, kind of following the trickle down, because that's what it was. And in the end, 510 votes, I think it was, separating
508?
Yeah, 510.
773,
yeah. Okay.
763. Well, anyway, 500 or so votes, that's more accurate. And I think that that was a small margin, but a vote is a vote, a win is a win, and they have their MP-elect there. But it's the blame game and the sort of fallout that came out of this that struck me, Francis. What dynamics were playing? Like, who was running this campaign? Why did we see that kind of thing happening on the back of that loss?
Joe, in politics, there's no number two. You win or you lose. Doesn't matter whether you lost by 1 vote or 2 votes or 27 like we saw in Muguga or 510 like we saw in Kiambaa. A loss is a loss. There's no number two in politics. And so you would have expected this kind of a reaction from Jubilee. There are those, especially the members of parliament, who are on the campaign trail, you know, day and night, so to say. And they probably felt that there are some party officials who didn't contribute or participate as much as they did, or as much as they would have expected, number one. Number two, there's also some blame game of sorts that some members of parliament who came to Kiambaa to campaign for the Jubilee candidate maybe ended up taking away votes instead of adding some votes. And so you would expect that kind of a reaction. But this was, I think, in my opinion, totally expected. Why? Because this is Jubilee's third loss in 4 months. They first lost, the Jubilee Party first lost in Rurie, then lost in Juja, and now lost in Kiambaa. And it was almost losing in Muguga. So that tells you there's a problem somewhat with the party. You've heard all manner of narrations coming from members of parliament that we started on a 10%, ended up on a 49%, which is an improvement. Unfortunately, those are political theories. The practical thing is that the party lost yet again. Yeah. And so probably there was need maybe for a review. And that kind of a review started with blame game. You saw Kanini Kega, the member of parliament for Kieni, who was actually on the campaign trail in Kiambaa, saying they know who to blame for the loss. Number one, within the party. And those are the officials they want to exit the party. It is unlikely, even as the interim vice chair, David Murathe, says they will hold party elections so that they can have, he calls them bona fide party officials. I highly doubt such a thing will happen. Why? Because you're looking at an election very, very close. And so there's a possibility of infiltration by the other contestant political parties. So the status quo will probably remain until maybe after the general election. And so that's the politics of the day. No number two. So the reaction that you saw, totally expected.
Yvonne, did you expect what we saw?
I don't think they expected what they saw, you know, more importantly, or perhaps they should have, because all signs show that the other side, who were sort of the underdog in the fights and had everything to prove, you know, were better organized. This was really Jubilee's election to lose, quite frankly. You know, this was their turf. But then again, people say that all the votes that were cast for both the top two candidates were all Jubilee votes, if you like, because it was sort of Jubilee A versus Jubilee B. But there was a big contestation in the party afterwards about just how involved the Secretariat was. Did the Secretary General, the Vice Chair, the Chair of the party and other officials go down to the ground and actually, you know, coordinate the campaign? Many questions about who exactly was in charge of the campaigns that were taking place on the ground. It was left largely to the elected officials, the politicians, as opposed to the party officials. And you take a look at what was happening on the other side, UDA, because this was something, you know, they had a point to prove, better organized perhaps. They set up a tallying center in Nairobi. They had about 300 agents for the 154 polling stations. You know, it was very clear who was driving what. But a lot of then is being said about the Secretariat's involvement in Juja, and that is what, you know, sort of led to the loss there, and that perhaps the decision was made to pull back. But, you know, regardless now, it's, you know, it's what's happening.
And I think we can get Kanini Kega, he spoke a little bit about that when he was blaming the SG and other people for what happened there.
We got a lot of support from our party leader, but the rest of the structure, you know, from the Secretary General going down, they did not offer the leadership that we expected. We also expected to see them on the ground. We didn't see them. So moving forward, because we have a party that listens. When we went to the ground, our party was not popular. Our rating was about 10%, but we were able to convince our people to the point that we at least got 50%. So moving forward, we have to make some changes, and some of the decisions that we are going to make are fundamental changes.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add that the Secretary General of the party was on a television interview yesterday, and he said, you know, the Kiambaa vote still gave a vote of confidence to the party. He said he was, quote, extremely proud of the party, and says the 50% approval rating is still a good rating, considering that, you know, the election ended peacefully, and considering that they were conducting a by-election, you know, in a COVID-19 pandemic, but still, you know, sticking to his guns that, you know, everything went well, and, you know, this is the result they expected, and in some way distancing himself from now what we're hearing, you know, that thinking of going to court. He said, well, you know, that's not exactly a party position, but that would have to be driven by the candidate, you know, himself. So, you know, it's going to be an interesting time, and it's not the first time that, you know, there have been calls for resignation of the party officials after the loss in a by-election.
A quick one, Joe. You see, there's a counter-argument to it. If you say there's a 50% approval, then it also means there's a 50% rejection.
Yes.
Ordinarily, if Jubilee was intact, as we knew it in 2017, there would be no discussion as to which party would win in Kiambaa, in Juja, in Rurie, in Gaturi, in all those by-elections.
Especially against very small new parties.
Yes. So it tells you, if there's a 50% approval, it also means the party has lost 50% support. And then there's also a counter-argument as well. So this 50%, was it in approval of the candidate or in approval of the party? Because by and large, when some polls were done, the Jubilee candidate then was, you know, had an upper hand. The party had a problem. So I remember, Joe, this discussion that strong party, weak candidate.
Yeah.
Weak candidate, weak party, strong candidate. And that's what played out in Kiambaa.
Which is why it was a tight race in that respect. I mean, there have been arguments. I think I saw Welie, he had an interesting tweet where he actually said that the party let down Karin Njama, saying basically that left to some other candidate, perhaps Jubilee would have come home with maybe 20% or something. An interesting argument.
Exactly, because Kariri Njama actually came number 2 to the late Paul Koinange in 2017. He got about 15,500 votes at the time. He ran as an independent candidate because he had issues with the nomination process in Jubilee. So he ran as an independent and got about 15,000 as compared to Paul Koinange, who got over 60,000 votes. And he was popular on the ground. And between 2017 and now, he was there. Mkazi wa hapo wanamjua. And I remember there was an event somewhere that the DP had attended somewhere in Central, and both him and Wanjiku both attended the event. In fact, walikuwa hapo nyuma. So I think even they tried to entice to him the Kariri to join the UDA bandwagon. I think alibembelezwa zaidi akienda Jubilee. And Wanjiku actually was their second choice, and they'd expected that Ujamato waletea shida. But it's what he said.
Will tell us, but it is said that Mwangi Wanjiku was actually Kariri Njama's campaigner at some point.
Actually, they were by and large together, so to say. The event that Jamila is alluding to, when the deputy president visited a place called Kawaida some times back, it is Kariri and Njuguna who are the hosts. So by and large, Kariri was part of the UDA team, so to say, or the deputy president's team for quite a while, until dynamics played out during nominations. And the dynamics was simple. The loss in Juja necessitated some changes in the party nominations in Kiambaa. That's why there were no nominations per se. There were interviews.
Yes.
And obviously anything can go, can happen in such an interview. Yeah. And the narrative was simple. If the candidate was to come from the former MP's family or team, it would have occasioned the narrative that we saw in Juja. And so that's why for the ruling party it was easy to try and pick Kariri to deal with that dimension. But of course the UDA team went ahead and got another candidate, molded him and made him a very competitive candidate, who ended up beating who was perceived the favorite or the runaway candidate in the constituency. That tells you something, that the party, actually the UDA candidate rode on the popularity of the party, of the UDA party. And the Jubilee candidate probably had a disadvantage as a result of the party. But also there's some national issues that were playing out at the constituency level. Economic hardships, the relationship between the president and the deputy president, those are factors that played out in the constituency and aided in the decision on who was voted
and that's an interesting thing you should say. I mean, there's been a lot of spin doctoring around this thing. I mean, everybody reads what they see. That thing about the people who are touching the elephant, some people saying it's like a snake, others saying it's like I don't know what. But it's quite interesting because right now we've had people who say, well, this proves that this wave of UDA and the DP and all of that in Mount Kenya region isn't as strong as it's been alleged, because they're saying if it was strong, why didn't we see 80%? Why didn't we see 90%? On the other side, they're saying, well, this is the president's backyard, and therefore we would not even have been talking about a contest. So there's a sense in which these two wings of what we knew as Jubilee will continue to have a real interesting back and forth contest in terms of the propaganda that then comes out of Kiambaa to try and sort of craft a narrative that they then push into 2022 general election. And I think that's going to be critical, because in all the calculus that, if you look at all the political sort of arithmetic that people have been doing, Mount Kenya region features very prominently. Like, it is difficult to imagine anybody's path to State House without Mount Kenya as it is, because it's a huge voting block, and for the first time it is almost like sheep without a shepherd, and therefore everybody's going in there to hunt and see how much they can hive off. And so it is almost fair to say that we still do not quite know how that region will end up, because, I mean, regardless of what may have pushed Kariri Njama's numbers down, or whether they were pushed up, nobody knows. But at the end of the day, the fact that with all the battering, with all the claims that Jubilee was basically dead, the fact that whether it's a candidate or whatever it is that they were a competitive party there, in some respects is something that I am sure that the UDA people will be thinking about. That even though we have won by 500 votes, how do we make sure that next time it is 30,000, it is 50,000, it is 60,000? They can't rest on their laurels and say, we have this in the bag.
Absolutely not. And, you know, just when you were talking about how every side is trying to spin this in their favor. So there's those who say, well, you know, this was a protest against...
Jamila is almost standing up, so let me finish.
All right, I had it. So those who say it's, you know, it was a protest vote against the BBI, against the handshake, against the proposed or perceived Jubilee ODM merger, and therefore saying that, you know, the result in Kiambaa sends a message to those who are seeking the endorsement of President Uhuru Kenyatta that, you know, he cannot necessarily deliver 100% of the vote. And then there's those on the other side, like in ODM, who might tell you that, you know what, 50% is good for us anyway, because we would never have gotten
too much.
Yes, we would never have gotten even 10% in that region. So everybody is trying to spin this in their way and, you know, put this to their advantage and use this. But whether this will be, you know, a propeller towards 2022 is still something, you know, that we wait to see.
And we're looking at the, you're talking about the central vote, how it's not easy for anyone to get into State House without getting that vote. And if you look at the 2013 and 2017 elections, the Jubilee Party got 94%, 91%, 96% in Murang'a, Kirinyaga, Kiambaa, both in the 2013 and 2017 elections. But if you remember in 2002, we had Mwai Kibaki on one end and we had Uhuru Kenyatta on the other. And Uhuru actually managed to get about 30% of the central vote at the time. And Mwai Kibaki was able to win the election because he got consolidated votes from other parts of the country. And maybe this is what they're hoping for, because we've said about how the Deputy President needs almost 80-90% of the votes in Central. And then from his Rift Valley backyard, the 80-90% that he'll get, for him to be able to actually have a chance at State House. But what if now following what we see happening in Kiambaa is extrapolated across the40 or what?
Extrapolate, yes.
Across the country. Wanaweza kukula votes zake kidogo. That 30% or 40% maybe that this other side may get may be enough to keep him out of the run. But now, as you said, you need to see how UDA can work towards getting this to 80%, 90%. But finally, also, you need to look at how UDA conducted its campaigns in Kiambaa. We had the 5 or 6 members of parliament, from Moses Kuria to the Ndia member of parliament. You had, I think, also the Kiharu member of parliament. You had also Senator Irungu Kangata, the Kikuyu MP, who actually took wards. They were actually campaigning ward, door to door, trying to get the youth to vote. Remember, we keep saying the youth are a large number of registered voters, but they maybe just show up at rallies and they don't show up to vote. And that is a campaign that was going on in Kiambaa. And also the marketplaces. They were doing, I think, barazas at the marketplaces almost every weekend. And also the fact that that message you're talking about, the national politics issues are being played, the issues of high cost of living, issues of maisha imekuwa ngumu, bei ya gas imepanda, all those factors came into play. And these guys played their game that way. Even what you're talking about having a tallying center, Yvonne, the 300 plus agents, walikuwa napiga picha, the ile form inatumwa directly kwa tallying center na wanafanya hisabu.
They were able to call the election.
But you have to understand, and I think this is important, we have to understand that the people who are in UDA, a good number of them, I mean, let's start with the Deputy President. By default or by design, he was quite heavily involved in the Jubilee election machine, both in 2013 and 2017.
And 2017, remember, even the party primaries, he was very hands-on at Jubilee Center.
And so, on the one hand, he is one person who, I think, partly riding on the sort of grassroots mobilization abilities that I think date way back to the Moi thing. He got a thing or two about Moi. That style that they had in Kanu, but also he's energetic. I mean, he can move from here to the other and that sort of thing. I mean, the only other politician that I think does that sort of thing, I don't know if he has done that now lately, but that's Raila Odinga. He also has this political energy that you see during that campaign period where he can be in 5 different places at the same time, and that's really what the Deputy President also does, and that has a way of connecting someone with all the unlikely people in villages and that sort of thing. So there is that, I think, the root of factor in this whole thing. And then, of course, I think some of the MPs that we saw there, the Moses Kurias of this world, those are people who are, again, very heavily involved in the Jubilee election machine. And therefore, the big question, I think, would be whether they are able to replicate that in other parts of the country.
Scale.
Do they have those kinds of people in literally every corner of Kenya who would be able to basically push this campaign to the level that we saw in Kiambaa? And I think it is quite easy to run around one constituency, which is very close to Nairobi, but it's a totally different ball game when you're talking about the entire country. So I think that the real test will be when suddenly now you're faced with races in 290 constituencies where every MP is trying to fight for their own seat.
Right.
And then there is a national thing
MCs,
that the
senators,
presidential
governors,
vote, which
presidential.
typically tends to be quite heated, and a lot of those MPs might not be present with the
because they're fighting for their own
battles.
their
So
own
that's
battles.
where the real test.
And I think
Joe, I look at it this way. One, there are 3-4 conclusions you can make from the Kiambaa by-election. Number one, this was a competition of people who are very familiar with each other. And maybe right from the candidates to the parties, even to the machinery, to the MPs who came to support the candidates in their campaigns. These are people who are very familiar with each other. Actually, these are people from one team, Jubilee. You saw an interesting scenario where Jubilee MPs were campaigning for a UDA candidate because it's the same team. One can even argue that it is Jubilee A versus Jubilee B that was in the race in Kiambaa. Number one. Number two, it is also not... The discussion around Jubilee being dead, I wouldn't say it's dead per se. It's not over, because there are some people who voted for the Jubilee candidate, well aware of the party that he was vying on. If it was, and that was the conclusion, they would have voted for somebody else because of that confirmation, that belief that the party is dead. Number three, the president has his supporters in the Mount Kenya region. He may not exactly garner the same support that he did in 2013 and 2017, but you can also not argue that he has lost everything. He still has something within his grip. And number four, finally, it is very, very early. Very many things are likely to happen between now and, let's say, March next year. A lot of dynamics will be at play. A lot of coalition making, alignments and realignments. So it's a bit too early. While it's a good victory for the UDA team, it's also not something that you can say will reflect across the constituencies in the Mount Kenya region, or 290 constituencies across the country. It's a little too early. Very many things are likely to happen between now and then. So many formations are going to come up and so many candidates are going to arrive. But ultimately, each of the members of parliament who are in Kiambaa will be in their constituency fighting it out with their opponents, because they also have opponents in their constituencies. So when it gets to August 2022, everybody will be... Oh yeah, I wanted to say that each man or woman for himself, and then God and maybe the parties for all of them.
And I think that is why, one second, the nomination exercises for these parties will be very, very interesting to watch in terms of who will get the ticket for which area. And we may see a lot of independents running in some of these areas if they don't get the tickets where they want.
Or most of them running to the so-called small parties.
And I think that's a good place to take a break, because when we come back, we want to talk about those coalitions. I mean, there have been all kinds of things going on along those lines, and at the moment, everything is quite hazy. We don't know really what's going on. But we'll try and figure it out when we come back, when News Gang returns right after this break.